Phainesis in zero ground. Showing the work. On the dissolution of the problem of ontological grounding by the Open Ground Society. 1. The problem of ontological grounding. For as long as philosophy has attempted to speak about being, it has encountered a difficulty that appears at the very threshold of articulation itself. The problem is deceptively simple to state and extraordinarily resistant to resolution. How can we say what being means without already presupposing it? Every attempt to do so seems to require the very thing it seeks to clarify. The word is appears unavoidably in every definition, every grounding claim, every explanatory gesture. Philosophy cannot begin without it, and yet cannot justify it without invoking it again. This is not a local failure of this or that metaphysical system. It is not a matter of insufficient rigor, imprecise terminology, or incomplete theory. The problem recurs with remarkable consistency across the entire history of ontology, cutting across traditions that otherwise disagree on nearly everything else. Whenever philosophy attempts to specify what ultimately grounds intelligibility, coherence, or existence, it encounters the same structural impasse. Grounding appears to require an external basis, yet any proposed basis must itself already be. The demand for grounding therefore folds back on itself, producing either circularity, regress, or conceptual collapse. What is striking is not merely that the problem persists, but that it persists predictably. Relation-based ontologies attempt to avoid substance by treating relations as primary, only to find that relations quietly harden into relata that behave like substances in all but name. Substance-based ontologies attempt to halt this slide by positing an underlying bearer of properties, only to generate an infinite regress of what grounds that bearer. Process-based ontologies seek escape by dissolving static being into becoming, but in doing so often lose the determinacy required for intelligibility to hold it all. And, in every case, attempts to define being end up presupposing the is they aim to explain. It is tempting to treat this as a failure of philosophical ingenuity, as though the right concept, the right distinction, or the right formalism simply has not yet been found. But the recurrence of the problem suggests something deeper. The impasse does not arise after philosophy begins, it arises because philosophy begins. The moment articulation attempts to ground itself, it runs into the limits of what articulation can do from within its own activity. Seen this way, the grounding problem is not merely a puzzle about reality, it is a constraint inherent to intelligible articulation itself. Philosophy cannot step outside its own participation in meaning to secure an external vantage point from which being could be definitively grounded. Any such standpoint would already presuppose the very intelligibility it seeks to justify. The failure is not accidental, it is structural. This realization shifts the character of the problem. If the demand for an external ground cannot be satisfied without contradiction, then perhaps the demand itself deserves scrutiny. Perhaps the difficulty does not indicate that intelligibility lacks a foundation, but that intelligibility does not require the kind of foundation philosophy has been seeking. The persistent failure to ground being from outside may not be a deficiency in our theories, but a signal that grounding, as traditionally conceived, is the wrong task. The question, then, is no longer how to locate a final ontological ground that secures being from beyond articulation. The question becomes whether coherence, stability, and constraint might already be operative within articulation itself, without appeal to anything external to it. If philosophy cannot stand outside participation to justify being, perhaps it must instead attend more carefully to what holds from within the act of articulation that cannot be escaped. It is from this pressure, this repeated, disciplined confrontation with the limits of grounding, that the perpetualist approach begins. 2. The perpetualist approach. Beginning from the impasse. The perpetualist approach does not begin by proposing a new ground for being. It begins by taking the grounding impasse seriously as a constraint rather than a failure. If philosophy cannot ground intelligibility by appeal to anything external without contradiction, then the demand for such grounding must itself be reconsidered. The starting point, then, is not a solution imposed upon the problem, but a disciplined refusal to bypass it. This refusal was initially articulated through what was called ontological ground zero. The phrase was meant to name a simple recognition. No system of thought can provide its own ultimate foundation without presupposing the very intelligibility it seeks to secure, and no appeal beyond the system escapes the same condition. Any attempt to ground articulation must already rely on articulation. The grounding problem, therefore, cannot be solved by adding one more explanatory layer beneath it. At this stage, the term ground zero functioned as a provisional marker. It was not intended to designate a foundation point, a minimal base, or a hidden substrate. It was meant to indicate the absence of any such point, the recognition that articulation begins without an external ground to stand upon. This recognition was not treated as a philosophical defeat, but as a factual condition that could not be avoided without incoherence. What followed from this recognition was not collapse, but an unexpected stability. Despite the absence of an external foundation, intelligibility clearly persists. Thought does not dissolve into arbitrariness. Language continues to function. Meaning remains constrained, corrigible, and responsive to breakdown. Coherence does not vanish, simply because no final ground can be supplied. This observation forced a reconsideration of what grounding had been assumed to do. Traditionally, grounding is taken to secure stability by anchoring it in something more fundamental. A substance, a principle, a law, or a structure that underwrites everything else. But if intelligibility continues to operate without access to such an anchor, then stability must be arising in another way. What becomes visible, when one attends carefully to this condition, is that openness itself is operative. The absence of a final ground does not result in chaos. It creates a field in which relation can occur. Articulation remains possible precisely because it is not closed by an ultimate foundation. Meaning is sustained not by resting upon something beneath it, but by remaining responsive within an unclosed field. This is the point at which the perpetualist approach diverges decisively from traditional ontology. Rather than treating groundlessness as a problem to be overcome, it treats groundlessness as the condition within which coherence already occurs. Stability is not achieved despite the absence of foundation, but through continuous recalibration within it. Constraint does not arrive from below, it emerges from the dynamics of relation itself. Within this open condition, articulation encounters a minimal but persistent structure. There is always a givenness that cannot be reduced away, an irreducible presence that resists complete specification. At the same time, this givenness never appears in isolation. It always takes form through engagement, differentiation, and consequence. Presence is inseparable from how it shows up. This structural pairing was articulated as isness and suchness. Isness names the irreducible fact that articulation always finds itself already within constraint, within a field of presence, resistance, and limit that it did not choose. Suchness names the way that this givenness differentiates through engagement, the manner in which what is encountered takes shape, stabilizes patterns, and leaves traces through interaction. Crucially, these are not two entities in relation, nor two levels of reality standing over against one another. They are co-structural aspects of what articulation encounters from within participation. Neither precedes the other, and neither can be eliminated without loss of intelligibility. Presence without differentiation collapses into indeterminacy. Differentiation without presence collapses into fiction. What holds is their mutual sustainment within an open field. This recognition allows the perpetualist approach to respond to the classical failure modes of ontology without attempting to outmaneuver them. Circularity is not resolved by finding a definition of being that avoids is, but by recognizing that articulation is self-sustaining within participation. Infinite regress is avoided not by positing a final ground, but by abandoning the demand for one altogether. Substance does not reappear covertly because no underlying bearer is required. Process does not dissolve into vagueness because coherence is maintained through equilibrium rather than fixation. At this stage, it appeared that the grounding problem had been addressed, not by supplying what philosophy had been seeking, but by recognizing why it had been seeking it in the first place. Yet this apparent resolution introduced a new difficulty. The framework could be articulated, but only with increasing strain on the language used to express it. Certain terms repeatedly resisted the work they were being asked to do. It was at this point that tension emerged, not in the concepts themselves, but in the vocabulary through which they were expressed. And it was this tension, rather than any new theoretical ambition, that would force the next refinement. Third, friction points, where language resists the insight. The first indication that further refinement was required did not come from theoretical inconsistency, but from repeated resistance at the level of expression. The framework could be articulated, its responses to the classical grounding failures could be stated, and its internal coherence could be defended. Yet the act of articulation itself began to feel increasingly strained. Certain terms demanded constant qualification. Others carried implications that the framework had explicitly rejected. The problem was no longer whether the approach worked, but whether the language available to describe it could do so without distortion. The most immediate friction appeared around the term ground zero. Although originally intended to signal the absence of an external foundation, the phrase persistently invited the opposite interpretation. Ground zero suggests a point, a base, a lowest layer from which something might be built. Even when explicitly denied, the metaphor quietly reintroduced the very logic it was meant to dismantle. Readers understandably heard ground and assumed some kind of foundational role, however minimal or paradoxical. This was not a matter of misunderstanding on the reader's part. It revealed a deeper problem. The language itself was guiding attention toward a conceptual structure the framework did not endorse. The term functioned as a gravitational center, pulling interpretation back toward foundationalism, even as the text argued against it. What had been intended as a negation began to behave like a covert affirmation. A similar, though more pervasive, friction emerged around the word being. Despite sustained efforts to qualify its use, being as non-substantial, being as dynamic, being as relational, the term repeatedly collapsed back into its inherited weight. Each sentence required defensive clarification. Each assertion risked being heard as a claim about an underlying entity or metaphysical substrate. The problem was not that readers were inattentive. It was that the word itself carried a historical momentum that resisted redirection. This resistance became especially visible in moments where the framework needed to emphasize activity rather than stasis. Phrases such as being coheres, being unfolds, or being manifests attempted to bend a static noun into a dynamic role. Grammatically, the effort succeeded. Conceptually, it did not. The verb is continued to do the wrong kind of work. It smuggled in fixity where the framework required movement, and substance where it required activity. What became clear was that these frictions were not accidental. They were systematic. They appeared wherever the framework attempted to articulate groundlessness without turning it into a ground, or activity without turning it into a thing. The more precisely the ideas were expressed, the more conspicuous the strain became. Language, shaped by centuries of metaphysical habits, kept reintroducing the assumptions the framework had rejected. At this point, it would have been possible to treat the issue as merely stylistic. to continue qualifying terms, adding disclaimers, and trusting careful readers to follow the intended meaning. But this would have missed the significance of what was occurring. The resistance was not cosmetic. It signaled that the conceptual labor being performed had outgrown the vocabulary inherited to perform it. Philosophical language is not neutral. It channels expectation, directs interpretation, and constrains what can be said without distortion. When a term consistently pulls understanding in the wrong direction, it does not merely obscure an insight, it reshapes it. Precision, in this context, is not pedantry, it is fidelity to what articulation encounters. The friction around ground zero revealed that the framework was not pointing toward a foundation at all, but toward the condition of groundlessness itself. The friction around being revealed that what was at stake was not an entity or state, but an activity, an appearing that could not be captured without turning it into something it was not. These pressures did not suggest that the framework was flawed. They suggested that the language used to express it was no longer adequate. To continue articulating the insight without distortion, refinement was not optional, it was required. The next step, therefore, was not to revise the framework, but to allow its own internal demands to reshape the terms through which it spoke. Fourth, first refinement, from ground zero to zero ground. The pressure exerted by the term ground zero could not be resolved by further clarification alone. Each attempt to explain what the phrase was not doing only reinforced what it seemed to be doing implicitly. The problem lay not in the argument, but in the metaphor itself. Ground zero, despite its intended negation, continued to suggest a point of origin, a base layer, a minimal foundation from which articulation might proceed. Even emptied of substance, it retained the logic of grounding. What the framework had actually encountered was something more precise and more difficult to name. It was not a foundational point, nor even the absence of one conceived as a point. It was the condition in which no foundation appears at all. The persistence of intelligibility was not being explained by reference to a lowest level, but by recognizing that articulation occurs without any such level being available. This distinction matters. To speak of a ground, even one labeled as zero, is to remain within the grammar of foundationalism. It implies that explanation ultimately rests somewhere, even if that somewhere is paradoxical or empty. But the perpetualist insight did not locate a final resting place. It encountered the absence of resting places altogether, and, more importantly, the fact that coherence does not collapse in their absence. The refinement from ground zero to zero ground was therefore not a shift in position, but a correction in orientation. The phrase zero ground does not name a thing. It does not designate a site, a base, or a hidden layer beneath articulation. It names a condition, the condition in which no external ground is encountered, and yet articulation persists. Zero ground is not something upon which intelligibility stands. It is the recognition that intelligibility does not stand upon anything. The difference is subtle but decisive. Where ground zero invites the imagination to picture a minimal foundation, zero ground refuses the image altogether. It signals the absence of foundation as such, not the presence of an especially thin one. Seen this way, zero ground is inseparable from what had already been described as openness. The two terms do not point to different features of reality. They name the same encountered condition from different angles. Zero emphasizes what is absent. No external foundation, no ultimate base, no final explanatory layer. Open emphasizes what is present, an unclosed field within which relation, differentiation, and recalibration can occur. The absence of ground is not a void. It is the condition that allows articulation to remain responsive rather than fixed. This clarification resolves a lingering ambiguity. Earlier formulations risked suggesting that one begins at ground zero and then discovers openness as a consequence. But what articulation actually encounters is that groundlessness and openness are not sequential. They are coextensive. To encounter zero ground is already to encounter openness. There is no foundational absence first, followed by relational emergence. There is only the ongoing condition in which articulation occurs without closure. Importantly, this refinement does not alter the framework's commitments. Nothing new is added. No explanatory layer is removed. What changes is the fidelity of the language to what is encountered. By relinquishing the metaphor of ground altogether, the framework avoids reintroducing the very logic it sought to escape. Zero ground does not solve the grounding problem by offering a better ground. It dissolves the problem by recognizing that grounding, as traditionally conceived, was never required for coherence to occur. What holds is not secured from below, but sustained through relation within an open field that has no external anchor. With this clarification in place, one tension was resolved, but another remained. Even as ground was no longer being smuggled back in through metaphor, the activity that occurred within zero ground still lacked a name adequate to its role. The framework had shed the language of foundation, yet continued to rely on a term, being, that carried its own distortions. The next refinement would be forced by this remaining pressure. The second refinement, from being to Phainesis. Once the metaphor of ground had been relinquished, a deeper tension became impossible to ignore. Even as zero ground clarified the condition within which articulation occurs, the framework continued to rely on a term that repeatedly resisted the role it was being asked to play. That term was being. At first, this resistance was subtle. It appeared as a need for constant qualification. Being had to be described as non-substantial, non-static, non-foundational. It had to be framed as relational, dynamic, open. Each of these qualifications was defensible in isolation, yet taken together they revealed a persistent problem. The word being was doing too much historical work of its own. No matter how carefully it was handled, it continued to invite precisely the interpretations the framework was trying to avoid. The difficulty was not merely historical association, though that was significant. Being carries with it 2.5 millennia of metaphysical sediment. Substance, presence at hand, underlying reality, what is most fundamentally the case. Even when explicitly denied, these associations linger. Readers encounter the term, already oriented toward an entity, a state, or a substrate. The framework, however, was not attempting to name an entity at all. It was attempting to articulate an activity. This mismatch became most visible when the framework attempted to describe coherence, emergence, or manifestation. To say that being coheres, or being manifests, is grammatically permissible, but conceptually strained. The noun insists on being treated as something that is, even when the intent is to emphasize what occurs. The verb is itself becomes an obstacle, reintroducing fixity where the framework requires movement, and substance where it requires activity. The tension here mirrored the earlier problem with grounding. Just as the demand for an external ground had been inherited uncritically, so too had the assumption that ontology must begin by naming what is. But if the grounding problem had taught anything, it was that such inheritances cannot be accepted without scrutiny. If intelligibility persists without external foundation, then perhaps it also persists without requiring a primary noun to anchor it. What articulation continued to encounter within zero ground was not a thing that exists, but an appearing that occurs. Meaning, coherence, and stability did not arise from a substrate beneath them, but from an activity that sustained itself through relation. The question, then, was not what being is, but how appearing happens at all, within participatory constraint. At this point, the language of being ceased to be merely inadequate and became actively misleading. It suggested that the framework was still seeking an ontological object, when in fact it had already moved beyond that search. To continue speaking faithfully about what was encountered, a different term was required, one that could name activity without turning it into a thing, and appearing without presupposing an observer standing outside it. The term Phainesis emerged from this necessity, derived from the Greek phaineste, meaning to appear or to show itself. The term carries an important grammatical feature often lost in translation. Phaineste is a middle voice verb. It does not describe an action imposed by an external agent, nor a passive reception by a detached subject. It names an activity in which appearing occurs through itself, within relation. The suffix sis reinforces this orientation. It does not denote an object or a completed state, but an ongoing activity. Phainesis therefore names not a thing that exists, but the event character of appearing itself, the activity through which intelligibility shows up, without requiring an external ground or an underlying substrate. Crucially, Phainesis is not introduced as a metaphysical replacement for being. It does not describe what reality is in itself, nor does it posit a new fundamental process operating beneath appearances. It names what articulation encounters once the demand for external grounding has been relinquished, self-manifestation occurring within participatory constraint. This clarification also resolves a lingering ambiguity in the usness-suchness structure. Previously, these terms risked being read as two elements in relation, or as layers of description applied to a deeper ontological core. With Phainesis in view, this risk disappears. Isness and suchness are no longer treated as separate components that must be coordinated. They are recognized as co-structural aspects of a single activity. Every instance of Phainesis involves both that it appears and how it appears. The irreducible givenness of participation, isness, and the differentiated forms that arise through engagement, suchness, are not added together. They arise together as aspects of appearing itself. There is no appearing without givenness, and no givenness without differentiation. Phainesis names this unity without collapsing it into substance or dissolving it into flux. The introduction of Phainesis therefore does not alter the framework's commitments. It completes them. It allows the framework to speak precisely about what it had already been describing implicitly, an activity that sustains coherence within zero ground, without appeal to anything beyond its own occurrence. With both refinements in place, zero ground naming the condition and Phainesis naming the activity, the framework could finally articulate its solution to the grounding problem without distortion. What remained was to state this solution clearly and to show how it resolves the classical impasses without reintroducing the assumptions that generated them. 6. The refined formulation, Phainesis in zero ground. With both refinements in place, the framework is able to articulate what had been guiding it from the beginning, now without distortion. The grounding problem no longer appears as a puzzle awaiting resolution, nor as a failure to be compensated for by ingenuity. It appears instead as a misdirected demand, one that dissolves once the conditions of articulation are properly attended to. What has changed is not the substance of the framework, but the precision with which it can now speak. Zero ground names. The condition encountered when the search for external foundations is relinquished. Phainesis names the activity that occurs within that condition. Together they allow the framework to say plainly what had previously required careful circumlocution. The refined formulation can now be stated without invoking a view from nowhere, and without presenting itself as a claim about reality as such. It is a statement about what holds wherever articulation occurs from within participation itself. What holds wherever articulation occurs is Phainesis in zero ground, relational self-manifestation within participatory constraint, requiring no foundation beyond its own, appearing for intelligibility to occur. This formulation does not describe an underlying structure of the universe. It does not propose a new metaphysical substrate or a fundamental process operating beneath appearances. It articulates what becomes visible when the demand for external grounding is released and attention is directed toward the conditions under which intelligibility already operates. Zero ground specifies that articulation encounters no final resting place beneath itself. There is no base layer to which explanation can ultimately retreat. This absence does not undermine coherence. It is the condition that prevents closure. Articulation remains responsive, corrigible, and open precisely because it is not secured by an ultimate foundation. Phainesis specifies what occurs within this condition. Appearing does not require an external cause or a deeper support to be intelligible. Within participation, appearing simply occurs, constrained by relation, stabilized through equilibrium, and differentiated through engagement. The activity does not ground itself. It does not need to. The demand for such grounding was the source of the problem, not its solution. Seen in this light, the isness-suchness structure is no longer something that must be explained or justified. It is encountered as an internal articulation of Phainesis itself. Isness names the irreducible givenness of participation, the fact that articulation always finds itself already within constraint. Suchness names the differentiated forms this givenness takes through engagement. Neither is primary, neither stands apart. They arise together as co-structural aspects of appearing. Crucial equilibrium remains central in this refined articulation. Phainesis does not unfold as unstructured flux. Within participation, coherence is maintained through continuous recalibration. Patterns stabilize, break down, and restabilize in response to tension. Determinacy is achieved without rigidity. Openness is preserved without collapse. The absence of external ground does not lead to indeterminacy because equilibrium functions internally, as a constraint encountered rather than imposed. This refined formulation resolves the classical failure modes without remainder. Circularity is not eliminated by definition, but rendered irrelevant by recognizing that appearing cannot be grounded without presupposing itself. Infinite regress does not arise because no external ground is sought. Substance does not reappear because no underlying bearer is posited. Process does not dissolve into vagueness because Phainesis is structured by equilibrium and differentiation within constraint. What is crucial here is that nothing has been added to the framework to make this work. No new metaphysical entities have been introduced. No hidden explanatory layers have been smuggled in. The refinements allow the framework to say, with clarity and restraint, what it had already been committed to implicitly. The grounding problem is not solved by discovering a deeper foundation. It is solved by recognizing that intelligibility does not require one. Once this recognition is articulated faithfully, the problem dissolves, not into silence, but into a clearer understanding of what has been sustaining articulation all along. What remains is not a final answer about reality, but a disciplined way of speaking that remains accountable to the conditions from which it cannot step outside. Phainesis in zero ground is not a doctrine. It is a formulation that stays within participation, naming what holds when philosophy ceases to demand what cannot be given. 7. Implications and orientations. The refined articulation, Phainesis in zero ground, does not remain confined to the problem of ontological grounding. Once the demand for external foundation is relinquished, the consequences ripple outward, not as doctrinal conclusions, but as shifts in how long-standing questions are approached. What changes is not the subject matter of philosophy, science, or ethics, but the posture from which these domains are engaged. When read through this lens, the history of philosophy appears in a different light. Many of its most persistent tensions can be seen as attempts to secure appearing by appeal to something beyond it. Plato sought stability by positing forms that underwrote appearances from elsewhere. Aristotle anchored intelligibility in substance as what persists beneath change. Kant divided appearance from noumenon in order to preserve objectivity without collapsing into skepticism. Heidegger distinguished being from beings in an effort to recover what metaphysics had forgotten. Each of these moves, in its own way, inherits the demand for an external ground that would guarantee appearing. Phainesis does not refute these positions by offering a superior theory. It reframes the problem they were responding to. What becomes visible is that the difficulty does not lie in appearance itself, but in the insistence that appearance must be secured by something other than its own occurring. Once this insistence is released, the elaborate architectures built to support it are no longer required. Appearing, as encountered within participation, does not need to be justified by appeal to what lies behind it. This reframing has important consequences for how scientific knowledge is understood. The refined articulation does not compete with scientific explanations, nor does it attempt to supply metaphysical interpretations of empirical results. It restricts itself to clarifying what is already operative in scientific engagement. Measurement, modeling, and prediction do not provide access to reality as it is in itself. They are modes of participation through which phenomena become determinate within constraint. In this light, the persistent puzzles of modern physics, indeterminacy, observer dependence, emergence, no longer require speculative, metaphysical supplements. They can be understood as expressions of Phainesis achieving determinacy within particular modes of engagement. This is not a claim about what quantum entities are independently of observation. It is a clarification of how phenomena show up as intelligible within the practices through which they are encountered. Science remains authoritative within its domain precisely because it operates skillfully within these constraints, not because it escapes them. The implications extend as well to questions of truth and knowledge. If intelligibility is sustained within Phainesis rather than guaranteed by correspondence to a hidden substrate, then truth cannot be understood as simple mirroring, nor does it collapse into mere consensus or perspective. Truth becomes a matter of coherence within participatory patterns, of whether articulation holds under pressure, remains responsive to correction, and continues to function across engagement. Error is not deviation from an inaccessible reality, but breakdown within these patterns. Ethical considerations follow naturally from this shift. If there is no external ground from which norms can be imposed, then ethical responsibility cannot consist in applying principles derived from elsewhere, nor can it dissolve into arbitrary choice. Responsibility emerges as responsiveness within Phainesis itself. Actions matter because they participate in the same field of appearing as everything else. They contribute to the stabilization or degradation of relational patterns that others must inhabit. Justice, in this sense, is not the enforcement of a transcendent order. It is the maintenance of conditions under which appearing remains possible for all participants. Harm is not defined by violation of abstract law alone, but by the foreclosure of phanetic capacity, the narrowing of openness, the rigidification of patterns, the collapse of equilibrium. Ethical failure appears as a breakdown in participation, not merely as disobedience. What unites these implications is not a new worldview, but a consistent refusal to step outside participation in search of guarantees. The refined articulation does not authorize sweeping metaphysical claims. It disciplines them. It insists that whatever is said must remain accountable to the conditions under which it is said. This discipline is not a limitation imposed from without. It is a consequence of attending carefully to what articulation already encounters. Phainesis in zero ground does not tell us what the world ultimately is. It tells us how intelligibility holds without requiring that question to be answered. It does not close inquiry. It keeps inquiry honest by preventing it from appealing to what cannot be given. 8. On terminological evolution and continuity. The introduction of zero ground in Phainesis may give the appearance of conceptual departure. New terms often do, but the function of this section is not to announce a change in doctrine. It is to make visible a process that has been operative throughout the framework. From its earliest articulations, refinement under constraint. Perpetualism did not arrive at these terms by inventing new commitments. It arrived at them by remaining accountable to problems it refused to bypass. The grounding impasse did not disappear when first named. It exerted pressure across subsequent articulations, testing the adequacy of inherited language at every step. What changed was not the framework's orientation, but its willingness to allow that pressure to reshape how it spoke. Earlier works employed the phrase ontological ground zero to register the recognition that no system can ground itself without contradiction. They spoke of being cohering through openness in order to emphasize relational stability without substance. These formulations were not mistaken, they were provisional. They did the work required at the time while carrying metaphors and grammatical habits that later proved misleading under closer scrutiny. The present essay does not disavow those formulations, it clarifies them. Ground zero is now understood as what was always meant by it. Not a foundation point, but the absence of any such point encountered within articulation. Zero ground names this condition more faithfully without inviting foundational imagery. Nothing is added, a metaphor is removed. Similarly, the shift from being to Phainesis does not introduce a new ontological posit. It releases the framework from a term whose historical weight repeatedly distorted what was being described. Earlier uses of being were already non-substantive, already dynamic, already relational. Phainesis allows that orientation to be stated without constant qualification. It names the activity that earlier language strained to express. Seen this way, the relationship between earlier and later terminology is not one of replacement, but of clarification. What was implicit becomes explicit. What required careful disclaimers now stands on its own. The framework's commitments remain intact, but its self-understanding becomes sharper. This mode of development is not accidental. It reflects a philosophical discipline that refuses to treat terminology as sacrosanct. Concepts are not preserved for their own sake. They are retained only insofar as they remain adequate to what articulation encounters. When they cease to be adequate, they must be revised or relinquished. Not because philosophy has changed its mind, but because it has listened more closely. To read the earlier corpus through the present refinement is therefore not to reinterpret it against itself, but to read it more precisely. When earlier texts speak of beginning from ontological ground zero, they should now be heard as pointing toward zero ground, the condition of groundlessness within which intelligibility persists. When they speak of being as coherent, they should be understood as describing Phainesis, the activity of appearing that sustains coherence without substrate. This clarification also guards against a common misunderstanding. The introduction of new terms does not signal a turn toward system building or doctrinal closure. On the contrary, it signals resistance to closure. Zero ground and Phainesis do not fix the framework in place. They prevent it from hardening around metaphors that no longer serve. They keep articulation responsive rather than canonical. What is preserved across this evolution is the methodological commitment that has guided the framework from the beginning, to remain within participation, to refuse external guarantees, and to allow problems to reshape language rather than forcing language to suppress problems. The refinements documented here are not endpoints, they are checkpoints, markers of where articulation has been compelled to become more precise in order to remain faithful. The continuity of the corpus lies not in the immutability of its terms, but in the consistency of its discipline. 9. Beyond being and becoming. This essay began with a problem that philosophy has never managed to leave behind. The demand to ground being has returned again and again, reshaped by different vocabularies, but driven by the same assumption, that intelligibility must rest upon something more fundamental than itself. The persistence of this demand has produced some of philosophy's most elaborate systems and some of its most enduring impasses. What has been shown here is not that the problem can be solved by better foundations, but that the demand for such foundations was misplaced. The grounding problem arises not because intelligibility lacks support, but because philosophy has repeatedly sought that support from outside the conditions in which intelligibility already operates. Once this outside position is relinquished, the problem does not vanish into obscurity. It resolves into a clearer understanding of what has been sustaining articulation all along. The refinements introduced, zero ground and Phainesis, do not add new metaphysical commitments. They remove distortions that had accumulated around older terms. Zero ground names the condition encountered when the search for external foundation is released. Groundlessness as the operative field within which coherence persists. Phainesis names the activity encountered within that field. The self-manifesting, appearing through which intelligibility takes shape without substrate or external guarantee. Together, these terms allow the framework to articulate its position without reliance on the inherited opposition between being and becoming. Being, as traditionally conceived, invites substance. Becoming invites direction and telos. Phainesis names neither. It names activity without substrate and appearing without external anchor. It does not replace being with a new essence. It reframes ontology as attention to what shows up within participation. This reframing does not collapse philosophy into phenomenology, nor does it dissolve ontology into epistemology. It remains ontological in the strict sense. It speaks to what holds wherever articulation occurs. But it does so without claiming access to reality apart from engagement. Ontology, here, is not a view from nowhere. It is disciplined fidelity to the conditions of intelligibility from within. What emerges from this discipline is not a closed system, but a posture. Philosophy becomes less concerned with securing ultimate answers and more concerned with maintaining coherence under constraint. It becomes a practice of staying with problems rather than escaping them through abstraction. Precision replaces certainty. Responsiveness replaces foundation. The problem of ontological grounding, approached in this way, reveals itself as a productive limit rather than an obstacle. It exposes the point at which philosophy must choose between imposing an external ground and remaining accountable to what it encounters. Perpetualism takes the latter path. It does not deny the desire for grounding. It shows why that desire cannot be satisfied without distortion, and how intelligibility persists without it. The result is not a doctrine to be adopted, but a clarification to be tested. If the refined articulation holds, it will do so not because it has been declared true, but because it continues to function, because it remains coherent, corrigible, and responsive across engagement. If it fails, it will fail from within and require further refinement. That is not a weakness of the framework, it is its governing discipline. What holds, wherever articulation occurs, is not a final ground beneath thought, but Phainesis in zero ground, appearing sustained through relation within openness, without appeal to what lies beyond participation. To remain with this recognition is not to abandon philosophy, but to practice it more honestly. For the minds that are ready,